So today we're very happy to have our own Shmuel Weinberger, who will speak about function spaces as geometric objects.
Okay. Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. Sort of. Yeah. So the title of my talk is an homage to Gromov, who many years ago gave a talk, wrote a paper with the title "Groups as Geometric Objects," which, arguably launched geometric group theory as a subject. I don't think I'm going to succeed as well in this echo. But that's sort of this somehow, but there's some spirit. It happens to be that some of the questions I'm going to discuss were raised by Gromov. So I've been sort of orbiting him, like a sparrow around a black hole or something for a while. But anyway, so let's start. So the trouble is, how do you, right? They're all, most people, what are function spaces, right? They firstly, they are amazing things, right? We go ahead and we add. I remember when I was a kid hearing about Fourier series for the first time, and people then told me that, well, the way you think about it is you make this vector space out of functions, right? And you define a dot product. And then the statement is that the sine functions and the cosine functions are the coordinate vectors. They're like, x and y, and Parseval's inequality means this, etc. And it was just sort of amazing, right? It's this act of violence, right? Because you think of a function, when you're a kid, as being some, or a 19th century person, right, as being the thing that has infinitely many values at different points, right? It's the thing that's enormously structured as an object in its own right. Right, but then you say, we're going to abstract it all away, and we'll just think about it as a point somewhere, right? And then, for a while, it feels just like this insanely clever accounting trick after you absorb it, right? And then you always, I guess analysts might have their own relationship to function spaces, but I'm not an analyst, and so we're working out what in public, I apologize, we're working on my relationship to function spaces. So that's what the theme is. So the question is, what can you say? So what's it like to live in a function space? Okay? Right? So that's sort of the question that I want to start off with. So of course there are boring answers, right? So for example, so we're going to be looking at maps from x to y, okay? So if x equals a point, okay, then, so then any space is a function space, right? It's a space of points from x to y. And then if you're an analyst, you're probably going to say y will be, I don't know, if y is a Banach space, right? You want to look at the linear theory first, right? So then, that has, some amount of geometry in there. And I don't know what I would, so this was a two-dimensional Banach space, drawn badly because it's not symmetric around the origin. It went to the best of my ability, okay? So one could do that, right? But what I really want to understand is sort of, in this case, the reason the function space has geometry is because you put the geometry in, right? So if I use L2, then the things are spherical. If I use L infinity, they look like cubes, okay? And there is some geometry there, and you could groove to that geometry, and, and this does make differences in life when you study these different things. But for me, that's not the thing that I want to focus on. I want to see emergent geometry, okay? All right. Okay. Later on, I'll maybe try to give you motivations, but at the moment, I'm taking this as if you have the soul of a geometer and you want to learn a field, you should try to impose geometry on the field and then pretend that the geometry emerged naturally. Okay. So of course, x equals k points. All right, boring. Okay, so let's begin talking about, some kind of other situations. Okay, so if the target is R, right, then this is, like Banach spaces. It has a geometric theory, right, but it's one that you're imposing on it, right? I mean, you start off with any x, you look at the functions on it, you decide what kind of functions you're looking at, and then, that imposes things, but that's tautological. Okay, so what happens sort of in the next interesting case, right? So suppose that the target, if the target is a circle, right? I mean, right? Let's just build up to seeing what it might be like to live in such a space. Okay, so firstly, I'm only going to talk about spaces of continuous functions, okay? There are some interesting spaces of discontinuous functions. I'm aware of that, and I even like some of them, but I'm not going to talk about them today. In fact, ultimately, almost everything will be about spaces of Lipschitz functions. And at some point, maybe I'll motivate why I make that command decision. But for the meantime, let's imagine, right, so what happens when the target is S1? Okay, so we know the truth. So let's, okay, right, the maps from X to S1, right, this is a union of components. I'm going to put in a base point just to make my life a little bit easier. It's not essential. Okay. I don't know. I'm fighting with myself over whether I want to put in the base point. Anyway, it's a union of components, right? One for each homomorphism. From pi 1 of x. And if you're the kind of groupoid, if, blah, 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 under some conditions, right? I mean, if x were disconnected and you want to worry about this kind of thing, right? So for each, right, and for every homomorphism from pi 1 of x to z, there is a component, okay? And every component is contractible. Okay? And if I remove the base point, then each component is homotopy equivalent to a torus. Okay? Where this was a 1 torus, but if I did it with an n torus, okay, that would be the answer. Okay? Right? I mean, so this could be an exercise in the first year course. Okay? About how to prove this. Okay. So firstly, so this is the output of algebra. This is what algebraic topology tells you, right? Algebraic topologists love function spaces. Okay, I mean, it's sort of one of their key tools for understanding a space is that they either map the space into things or they look at maps from things into the space, right? So, and I'll say insulting things about algebraic topologists later. Okay? But now I want to begin putting in a little bit more geometry. Imagine that I have a function and that I'd like to discuss it in some way, right? That I was interested in the function space because I was interested in the functions, which means that I have to be able to describe the functions. Okay, and nowadays, if you're going to describe a function, you're going to say, who are you describing it to? Okay, so maybe you're going to be describing it to a computer. Okay, so how would I describe a function? You see, right, I can't go ahead and say its value at every point. Okay, right? It just isn't time, right? So what am I going to do? What I will do is I'll fix a Lipschitz constant. Okay, so let me just remind you, because the Lipschitz constant is L if the distance between f of x and f of x prime is at most L times the distance between x and x prime. Okay? Okay, so this is a hypothesis that you could have on a function. Okay? When you're differentiable, this applies where L is the sup of the norm of your differential. Okay? In any. Okay? So, right, this is a friendly condition. Then there's magic that if you have in decent worlds, the space of Lipschitz functions is dense in the continuous functions, and this mapping spaces are homotopy equivalent. Okay, so if you like, this is a way of making your space that has like space filling curves and other shit inside of them, accessible to a human being and describable to a computer. Okay, so now if the computer has 7 digits of accuracy and my Lipschitz constant is 10 cubed, right, that means that I'm going to have to choose some net of points inside my domain space X that are like 10 to the minus 10th dense. Okay? And then I'll, go ahead and, or maybe one more digit than that because I'm going to have to do some rounding, right? Because the value of the function will be whatever it is. Okay, but, you do a little bit of bookkeeping, but then you could input the function, right, with that amount of data. Okay? So let me just comment. So that implies already a theorem that the volume, okay, this theorem is either true or morally true, depending on your feeling about the fact that I'm not going to define what I mean by volume. Okay? The volume of the space of maps from X to Y that are L Lipschitz is exponential in L to the dimension of X. Okay, so what do I mean by this? I mean, if you want to specify my function to within epsilon, where epsilon is decided by practicalities, like I said 10 to the minus 3 before, if I'm on the sphere, I certainly would worry about points being antipodal to each other, so then I might let epsilon be the diameter of the sphere. That might be too bold a choice for many of you, and then you might choose epsilon to be the size of the polar ice cap, right? I mean, you choose an epsilon, but whatever epsilon you choose, in order to go ahead and cover yourself by epsilon balls, okay, this is the number of epsilon balls you would need to capture that amount of information. Okay? So that at least I've shown you that this is an upper bound for what the volume is. Okay, lower bounds we could worry about, maybe worry about later. I don't really. These are my notes, and they determine more than one talk because they're sort of, random transitions between different lines. So. Okay, so anyway, so this tells us around how big this space is. Now, to an algebraic topologist, there's a natural scale, right, which is, like if I were on the sphere and I have 2 functions that are never antipodal, okay, then they are homotopic. And what do? I take TF plus 1 minus T times G, right? I do the straight line homotopy, and then I push it, and then I radially push it out. So for that value of so that's sort of a good value of epsilon. And I know that that the epsilon neighborhood of any point is canonically contractible, right, by that method. And for every reasonable space, like every Riemannian manifold, I could find some epsilon called the convexity radius, where I could go ahead and do such arguments. So there's, so in some sense, from the point of view of doing algebraic topology, so the base of the exponential will be dependent on the epsilon. Okay, it'll maybe involve like 1 over epsilon or 1 over epsilon to some power, depending on what the dimension of y is. I mean, I'm not thinking about that issue. Okay, but from the X point of view, this is sort of around how big the space is. Okay, all right? So far, so good? Okay, so, all right, so we have this kind of volume idea. This volume idea is very natural if you're trying to approximate functions. So already in the 19th century, people were looking at this kind of measurement of different function spaces in order for purposes of approximation theory. Okay, we have a corollary of this, which is, okay, So I'm calling this a theorem, so therefore I'm allowed to have a corollary, okay, which is that, firstly, the number of components of the L-Lipschitz maps from X to Y is O of X of L to the dimension of X. Okay? So let me unpack this. Okay, so this is, by the way, false, as stated. You'd think that this wasn't even a statement, so it couldn't be false. But, okay, so let's just think about, what we were doing. In principle, you go ahead and you do some construction and then you project back in. That projection might actually increase lengths a little bit, right? I mean, you imagine that you have, your target Y looks like this. And then when I want to do that TF plus 1 minus T gadget, I do that, and then I'm going to project inwards, right? So that will increase the Lipschitz constant, right? So if I want to say the number of components of the L-Lipschitz map, I really mean the L-Lipschitz maps included in, say, the 2L Lipschitz maps, okay? Or so where 2 is some number like 1.1 or 1.01, you can negotiate the value of 2, okay? Right? Okay? Right. So you'll notice, by the way, by geometry, I'm meaning coarse geometry, by the way. Okay? But so far, please interrupt me if I'm being unclear. I'm not being precise, but I hope I'm being clear. Okay? Okay? So now, subject to this thing, for example, you look at the maps from X. Okay, we'll go back to the circle. We could even let X be the circle. Right? So then it's mapped from Z to Z. So there's one number, there's some integer. Okay, and I'm saying that integer, right, is bounded in this exponential way in terms of the Lipschitz map. Okay? That's the content of this observation. Okay? So let me just comment, right? Why do we know this? Well, remember, we know that there's a covering by balls of this size. And we argue that any two things in one of those balls we can connect by a straight path together with, together with a projection. So that's a one-parameter family of things that connects one thing to the other. Okay, right? So we've given a proof of some statement of this general sort. Okay, so let me first comment why this is non-trivial, and then I'll comment why this is unsatisfactory. Okay, then I'll comment about why it's the best possible. Okay? And then I'll still improve on it. Okay? And after I've done all of those things, we can move to the next line in the talk. Okay, so what follows from our Zela Ascoli is that this is finite. Okay? So by putting in this Lipschitz condition, assuming the target Y is compact, then if you imagine that you had a whole series of functions, and then you would know you'd be able to get a convergent subsequence, but you wouldn't get, right? So if you'd be able to and you know that two things that are sufficiently close are homotopic. Okay? So our Zela Ascoli gives you the estimate that this thing is finite. Okay? So this is an improvement of that, right? It gives you a quantitative improvement. Okay? I want to point out, let's think about this case. When the target is a circle, though, then the truth is, okay, Ham of pi1 of x is going to be a finitely generated group. So Ham of pi1 of x to z is like a z to the k for some k. Right? I mean, that's what it is. And then the Lipschitz maps are a ball in some Banach norm on that z to the k. Okay? So the real truth is that this grows, when the target, so for y equals S1, the truth is that the number of components grows like L to some degree, but the degree, of course, is not related to the geometry of the function space. It's related to the topology of the domain space. Okay? Right? So it's a different kind of estimate. Right? So this degree is basically, if you like, the first homology of x or something like that. Right? It's the first Betty number tells you what the degree of this polynomial is. Okay, and the proof that this is right is, comes from this, right? You think about, I have a circle that's a generator. I have an L-Lipschitz map, okay? So, and I'm trying to use it to compute a winding number, okay? So I just go ahead and I see, if you like, lift that, use the lifting definition. I start on the circle, I lift to the cover, and since it was L-Lipschitz, it's L-Lipschitz when I've lifted, so it's stretched at most L. Okay? And since for every generator in the fundamental group I have, I know that I'm at most L, I know that this thing here is at most, it looks like at most the cube inside of that Ham group. Okay? Okay, right? So this looks like it could be far from the truth. Okay? It's interesting that, right, we see why L to the dimension of X is kind of important for, if you like, the information theoretic content of a function. Okay? But there are many times where this is not optimal. Okay? And so let me just comment, though, the truth is that if you look at, say, the maps from Sn into a torus wedge Sn, okay, I have to think, maybe it's even a 2 torus. No, let me make it an n torus. So this one really has x of L to the n number of components. Okay, so that's a good exercise, for people who like trying to visualize things and and it's much easier to draw these functions than it is to write them down. But, with a little bit of pictures, etc. So this really is, in some sense, the best estimate you can get about the first piece of algebraic topology, which is, okay, which is just a naive question about, how many components are there? Okay? With, of course, there's sort of this also tension, right? So let me begin drawing this function space, maps from S1 to S1, right? And here I have the constant map. And what I claim is that, I'm just drawing this, going up forever. And it's it's either contractible or it's a circle because you have a choice of which constant it is. Depends on your base point version or not. When the Lipschitz constant is 1, you begin getting 2 more components. Okay? Lipschitz constant 3. Right, this is the picture we have, suggested by what we've said so far. Okay? But I haven't really explained to you why these things are, are these pictures right? Or not? Right? Right, these pictures are evocative pictures of some sort, but are they really right? So let's just think about, suppose F and G lie in the trivial component. Okay? And I'm going to do the based version, just, to make life a bit easier. Okay? So then, what do I, so if they lie in, what do? I, take log F and log G. These are now going to be functions from the circle to R. Okay? And then, the way I find the homotopy is I take T log F plus 1 minus T log G. Okay? I just do the straight thing. Okay? And this will have always Lipschitz constant L. Okay? All right? So let's, right? If you like, by thinking about derivatives, if all else fails. Okay? So firstly, it really is correct that the various sublevels are convex. Okay? So this is an accurate picture of the homotopy type. Okay? You might object and think that, that from the time direction, maybe it's expanding. Right? If you try to think about this, because, as this function, as this becomes L Lipschitz and the function f becomes bigger, you're multiplying t by a big number. Okay? So this picture, your naive picture where they look like cylinders, right? You're missing some of the geometry of these spaces because these spaces are actually getting wider as you go up. Okay? And that should be part of your mental picture of this space. Right? So, that was just sort of doing the exercise for the simplest case where the target is a circle. The first is a non-trivial case. Okay? People still with me? Okay, good. And by the way, this picture is you could ask, so is this picture the story? Well, we know that algebraic topology is hard. Right? That components are not always essentially contractible. Right? There's this whole big subject. Right? So the question is, how much of this can we, really understand about this picture? So by the way, everything that I said so far generalizes completely to the situation where the target has non-positive curvature. So if you like a graph or a hyperbolic manifold, tori, in all of those cases, this is the picture of the function space. It grows, it grows. There's some critical L where the component is born. The whole topology is born at that moment, and it canonically deformation retracts to its moment of birth forever after. Okay? And for people who know about non-positive curvature, it's pretty easy to modify what I said for the case of the circle. It's just a matter of, it's an exercise in the definitions. Okay, so I'm going to be pushing to the opposite extreme from non-positive curvature targets. Okay, and mainly I'm going to be focusing on the case where the target is simply connected. Okay. Okay. One reason is it sort of is an opposite extreme to non-positive curvature. Okay. There are also good reasons based on algebraic topology. Or let's just think about, before we do that, just think about the case where we take S1 with a base point and I'm going into a space X. Okay? So this is a function space and I'm looking at all the loops on this space X. Algebraic topologists love this. One reason is because if they cared about the homotopy groups of X, then when they look at this space, instead of having to study pi 2 of the space X, you're now studying pi 1 of this space. So if you think that pi 1 is something you can wrap your head around, that's an advantage, right? You hopefully push it down a little bit. Of course, you've done it at the cost of going to you had a beautiful space like the two-sphere, now you take the loops on the two-sphere, it's an infinite dimensional space. Okay, so in order to succeed at this operation, you have to begin getting comfortable with various function spaces. And a lot of that was done in the first half of the last century, where first Morse looked at spaces of loops on manifolds, and he gave some kind of description of them, at least for very concrete manifolds like the sphere. So he told you that if you looked at the loops of an n-dimensional sphere, then there would be an it would be a complex, there'd be a CW structure on it that had one n-1 cell, one 2 times n-1 cell, one 3 times n-1 cell. He gave a beautiful cell description, did a lot of concrete things in order to understand the topology of this space. It was overall a failure because he needed to have very, very explicit X's to do that, and it was Serre who introduced really the algebraic tools, and ultimately one of the results were that say the homotopy groups of a finite simply connected complex can be algorithmically computed. Okay, that was a result of Ed Brown, but it was based on the ideas of Serre, and a lot of it is that somehow this object that we are focusing on, we're thinking about it not as a geometric object, but as an algebraic topological object, turns out to be, you could deal with it by sort of inexplicit algebraic tools, okay, that are very, very hard to understand. If you want to understand it the way we felt like we understood this, it looks pretty hopeless. Okay? So part of my animating impulse is that I want to be able to be as friendly with these spaces, at least to the point of understanding what the algebraic topologists are telling me. Okay? Right? So, and the other thing to say is that if the target X is not simply connected, computing homotopy groups are in general undecidable. You cannot decide, right? This thing is called the word problem. If I give you a closed curve on a space, and I want to know, can I homotop it to a constant? In general, that is an undecidable question. There is no algorithm to decide it. So that means I have some like low Lipschitz constant, and I want to know, is it in the component of the identity? Right? That's what it is. Is this element trivial or not? Is it in the component of the identity? Okay? And the answer to that is, in general, it's undecidable. Okay? For the simply connected case, it's tautologically, the answer is always yes. Okay? So I'm assuming that the answer is yes. Okay? So now, that doesn't feel satisfying. Okay? I'm going to assume that, okay, I want to study the components, but now I'm going to do the simply connected case where I assume that everything's in a component. So now let me ask you, okay, you know, if you want to get home from here, right, and you ask, can I get home? Can someone help me get home? And the algebraic topologist said, well, yes, you can because you're in the same component. Okay, fine. Okay, that's some kind of help, right? But what you really want to know is maybe what is the distance? What is the diameter, right? Even if you know, right? So you know, part of what I want to describe is sort of a theory of diameter for function spaces. Okay, so in other words, I have F and G that are L-Lipschitz maps from, let me call it A into Z, because, right? So that anyone who hasn't been paying attention can join now, new letters, okay? And are homotopic. You know how I know? I asked, you know, the algebraic topology oracle, and they told me that this homotopy group is trivial, so that's how I know that these are homotopic. Okay? And what I'd like to know is, what can I say about the homotopy from F to G? Okay? So remember, the homotopy is a map from A cross an interval into Z. Okay? So we assume that there's this capital F exists. It's a one-parameter family of these things. Okay? With some effort, I could make the capital F. Okay? Right? I mean, it has whatever, you know, it has whatever size it has. I mean, that connected dot argument would enable me to, if I would enable me to make this through Lipschitz functions if I want, right? I mean, you know, none of that kind of thing. If this has a Lipschitz constant L prime, whatever that is, okay, then, you know, there's something weird. You see, I mean, this direction is a little bit weird, right? I mean, the fact that in algebraic topology we always use 0, 1, this gets around the question of diameter, right? Because if this is L Lipschitz, then in this direction, the points are moving L. Okay? So if I want to understand the motion, I should also be keeping track of the time direction. Okay? So here's a little exercise. If I knew that this thing was L prime Lipschitz, then the arguments that I gave before would tell me that I could do this X in L prime to the dimension of A. You should just think about a little lemma from graph theory. Okay, I start off by, okay, think about it. I have a graph that has at most V vertices, and I'm told it's a connected graph. So you're supposed to show that the diameter is at most V. Okay? Okay, I think that lemma in graph theory, we all know, that just means this. Right? We have this function space. If we knew that we were in the L prime stuff, we could at least get some estimate about how far we have to be moving things out of that. And that would be, you know, if you want to plug in algebraic topology as an oracle. Okay? You know, which is the first thing you do, you know, before you can do anything better. Okay? But the other question is, do I know what L prime is? If these things are L Lipschitz, you know, can I predict in advance what the Lipschitz constant is going to be for the homotopy. Okay? So, can I predict L prime? Okay? I'm going slower than I planned. I should just increase my Lipschitz constant. And that will solve, these problems. Anyway, okay, so let me tell you a theorem that's now about 15 years old, I think. And it says the following are equivalent for a finite complex Z, okay? Like compact manifolds, for example, the kind of thing we've been thinking about. And so the first one is that there exists a constant that just depends on the dimension of A, such that if F and G map A to Z are L Lipschitz and homotopic, then they are C, okay, C of this dimension, L Lipschitz homotopic. Okay, so this is scoring a victory. Then what you might begin asking people is, can they estimate this constant? Right, this constant, of course, will depend on what Z is. Okay, there's a trivial case when Z is a point. Okay, that one, and I leave it as an exercise if Z is contractible. Okay, and then you would the C you might use would be the Lipschitz constant of the retraction of the Okay, so there are some trivial cases where you can have this. Okay, so that's condition 1, and condition 2 is that all homotopy groups of Z are finite. Okay? Okay? So this is a theorem that Steve Ferry and I proved, I don't remember when. I think it was before I was ever chair. Okay, so we're talking about a different millennium. Okay? This is an old theorem. It's sort of, firstly, it's a positive result. There are some non-trivial cases which it applies to. To an algebraic topologist, this is kind of striking because the understanding of infinite homotopy groups, when you tensor with the rationals, there's a whole subject called rational homotopy theory, so you feel like the vector space is involved, the Z's that are involved, you feel that those are under control, or at least they're subject to understanding by the human mind. Okay? It's sort of the finite order stuff that makes the heart beat pit-pat, right? And here it says that all of that stuff is actually understandable, at least within this geometric context. Okay? So that's sort of, a strange aspect of the theorem. It feels a lot stronger than one could hope for. And what turns out to happen is that for this finite case, this is the picture that emerges. Okay? Firstly, exercise, for those of you who know what obstruction theory is, that under this condition on the target, there are only finitely many of these tubes. Okay? And it's not the case that everything is born at once. Okay? That part of the picture is too much. There's some slop built in. Okay? But what is happening is that the sub-level sets, the picture looks crudely like this. There might be several components, that at some high level something will be born, but there's a predictable place, where this is at most Lipschitz, at least, growing linearly in size, but the truth is, I think finite actually works. Okay? So these things here end up having essentially bounded diameter. This picture, this is what those function spaces look like, at least coarsely. Okay, I mean, there really is a nice picture along this side. Okay, okay. So let me say, the next thing I'm supposed to do is explain why is this interesting. So my first comment is it's obviously interesting. Okay, we did that part. Science fiction. Okay, so let me tell you. I'm going to tell you a science fiction story that leads to a theorem that's a recent theorem. So it's sort of a good science fiction story. Yeah. So by the way, so most people don't do science fiction the way I do, which is, they invent things and they have characters and there are plots and emotions and stuff like that. No, I'm just making up bullshit science. Okay? Okay, not at all true. Okay, so the first thing is that I want to give you like a bullshit model of DNA expression. Okay, so this is what DNA looks like. Okay, when you unwrap it. Okay, there are sort of a whole bunch. There are several of these, like 24 or something. I don't know. It depends on the animal, not necessarily animals. Okay, and I'll talk about people, and we'll just look at one strand. Okay, and this is the way they start. They always start off with these things called telomeres, and those don't do anything. Okay, they just say, this is where a strand is beginning and this is where something is ending. It turns out that it's really bad. When you lose telomeres, you're aging, and ultimately you die. Okay? Yeah, so a lot of the age-improving things are trying to figure out ways of giving people telomeres back or preventing telomeres from rubbing off. They're very important because DNA strands break and have to be re-put together, and if you put strands together the wrong way, you're fucked. Okay? So in order to know where to put these two things together, you say, oh, the telomere is here, the telomere is there, I better glue these two parts together. Okay? If a DNA strand breaks in more than one place, that's probably also not a very good thing. Okay? Okay. That part isn't bullshit. Okay? That was hard-earned knowledge, which involved lots of conversations with ChatGPT. Okay, so now what happens is, DNA is like this sequence of binary things. I mean, they say Z mod 4, but we don't care, right? It's this bunch of things, and groups of 3 are called codons. And what they do is they produce they tell the body which protein to build. Okay, so if I have one protein, that's a point. Okay, if I have 2 proteins, then I have a combination of those 2 points. Okay, if I have 3 proteins, well, then there are 3 things, and I might have a simplex, but it might be that there's no piece of DNA that simultaneously does all 3 proteins. Okay? Right? So there is a space X, which is called local DNA expression space. Okay? And, as I go through the space, I imagine that, like, my messenger RNA or whatever it is, I forget the right words, I'm at this point, it looks at my neighborhood, it sees what local expression of proteins it would be coding for, and that means that as I move from this space, right, I'm really getting a path in this space X. Okay? So this is a path that starts at telomere, ends at telomere. So this is a map from circle into this space X, which is local DNA expression space. Okay, now, this kind of model for a function, right, this is what occurs in immersion theory, right? If I look at an immersion, I think of it as a continuous function from the domain space to the space of local immersions. Okay, and that's how immersions are classified.
So is this a simplicial complex that you construct?
Oh, God.
Well, I mean,
you get a drink.
Simplex, right?
Yeah, no, so the local DNA expression space would be a simplicial complex that allegedly, okay, I haven't really begun the worst science fiction yet, okay? This is just sort of the beginning of the story.
You said that one of these things that has a number of expressions.
So there are various things that are going on. Firstly, I'm lying and that I'm, all of this is combinatorial and I'm pretending it is as if it's continuous. Okay? Right? I mean, there are just many, the number of lies that I'm telling is really enormous. Okay?
You better not have questions.
So this is a pretend. I mean, so what happens is, the DNA sequence is read, and it isn't read infinitesimally, it's read at some scale. There is a relevant scale, because it takes 3 codons to describe a protein. Okay? But now I'm imagining that that's not the most relevant scale for certain properties, that you really, single proteins do almost nothing. Okay? They're always acting in combinations with other proteins. Okay? So therefore, when we're looking at the things, we're not just going to say, oh, what is the collection of these? Now, of course, a lot of people who do genetics, in fact, just do. They just see which are the proteins coded for, this gene is missing, blah, blah, blah. There are coarse things you could see from that, but I want to think bigger than that. Okay? At some other point, I tell you why, but that's not for here. This is, yeah.
I know this is science fiction, but are you always building something connected, or can they start building one thing over here and then another thing?
Yeah. So at the moment, I'm just thinking about the strand of DNA as giving me a map into a certain loop space. Okay? And now this loop space will be connected if it's the case that whenever you have 3 proteins that can be coded for, whenever you see, each of the pairs, you would find all 3. If that's something that's true, it's an empirically askable question, which when I lectured to biologists about this, they were all willing to grant me. They said, oh, yeah, these things are mixed up, blah, blah, blah. I don't know why they believe that, but they were willing to grant it. And that's the rope which I will use to hang myself. Okay? I need some rope, but I'm not done yet. Okay? Okay? So this is, okay? Now we have a lot of chromosomes, so we might have several of these functions, etc. Okay? But, so this leads us to think about, DNA, okay, as being, an element in some function space. Okay, I mean, I don't know how to draw a function space. It's a loop space, right? Okay, right? I mean, this is the kind of thing I said we want to study this space. Okay? But now, okay, one thing that we would care about might be the Lipschitz constant. That is related to how much information is in the DNA, it's how long it is, right? There is a natural scale, right? I mean, 1A, G, T, or C, right? So there is a natural scale, so that therefore increasing the Lipschitz constant means that you're having more DNA. It might be that some of it is DNA that doesn't get expressed. Not everything is expressed. Okay, right? I mean, some of those issues, already came up. Okay, but so you have this. So now you want to think about evolution. So, so I'm like over here. Right, I'm somewhere in this function space, right? And that's what happens, right? And if it were asexual, right? So this is not a model now of sexual evolution for sexual species, right? Then my descendant would be identical to me. Okay, so now the model that that people then do is they imagine that there's a fitness function, okay, which I will imagine is related to the Lipschitz constant because from the selfish gene's point of view, that's sort of the most expensive thing. But really, if this were to be a real model, less science fiction-y, you'd have a lot to do. But one of the things you would do is you would be modeling your fitness functions better than just the Lipschitz constant. Okay? But anyway, let's do that. And now you would think that, in perfect asexual evolutionary situations, what would happen is I would beget myself, it would be very, very boring, and the evolution wouldn't take place. Right? I'd beget myself. Okay? But of course, what happens is that there are random mutations. Okay? And so, by the way, like physicists, I'm thinking about lower energy being better than higher energy. Right? So this would be able to accomplish the same thing more cheaply. Okay? So there are random perturbations either to the environment, mutation, things like that cause you to have a random walk in this space. Okay? And now, when you look at the usual models of this kind of situation, which occur in chemical dynamics and things like that, the pictures typically look like this. Okay? This is some kind of energy function. Temperature tells you how likely you are to be. You tend to move in the direction of the gradient. You tend to move downwards. Okay? But temperature knocks you in the other direction. Okay? And what ends up happening is that for each fixed temperature, you end up having some distribution which is concentrated near the local minima. So in other words, things adapt to their environment and are fittest for their environment. Okay? Every now and then, there's a transition where something will evolve to the other kind. It goes in both directions. Although, what happens is it takes a lot longer for this guy to climb up this way than it takes this one to do the transition. Okay? So that's what non-equilibrium thermodynamics is. So now the question is, if you were looking at loop spaces, and you're trying to look at these critical points of the Lipschitz constant, right? How high do you have to go, right? Is there, I'm asking about the non-equilibrium statistical mechanics of this evolutionary model. Okay? Can we understand anything about this? Okay? So here's the theorem, which sort of says that, yes, you don't have to wait infinitely often for this to happen in a simply connected case. Okay? And then I'll tell you, this theorem is anomalous, and I'll explain to you why. Okay? So the theorem is this. It says that if you consider the homology of the space of maps from a one-dimensional complex into a space X that's simply connected, I do this so that you can consider loop spaces and free loop spaces. I mean, you don't really care about anything other than those. Okay? And I care about, okay? Oh, my phone is telling me that it's time for me to begin shutting up. Okay. Okay? And now I ask for the ones with Lipschitz constant less than L. Okay? Then there exists a C such that the inclusion of this into the guys with Lipschitz constant less than CL for L large, that this image is identical to the image in the whole function space. Okay, so concretely, right, this thing, the height that it would have to go through, right, I mean, which is a real energetic cost, okay, which determines the speed of evolution, that thing here, actually, it's even L plus a constant, okay? So that's the thing that's anomalous in the theorem, that you get L plus a constant, okay? But anyway, so that's kind of, so it sort of means that that in this model, if you had this property of local gene expression, blah, blah, blah. Okay, this is so bullshit. This is not a good model of evolution. It forgets that there are, say, environmental changes. It forgets that I'm in competition with you for having my progeny continue. Here I imagine just, that it would monoclonal and that, everything is wrong with this model. But it still did lead to asking this question. And so this is a theorem that was proved last year in the spring by Jonathan Block, Fedya Manin, and I. Okay, and we also solved the question of Gromov in when K is higher dimensional. Yeah, so So now, just the most naive thing, it would be zero-dimensional homology. We have functions, and we ask, how much do you have to increase the Lipschitz constant? The question I asked on the other board, how much do I have to increase the Lipschitz constant in order to find the homotopy? Right? Here I'm saying I have to increase the Lipschitz constant additively. The natural question to ask, and what Gromov asked originally, was doing it multiplicatively. And that's what I had on that board, and it makes sense, because if I have two different metrics, right, the length of curves from one metric versus the length of the curve in the other metric, those are differing multiplicatively, not additively. I can't really compare the function spaces to each other, right? So if so if I be wanting to add, it's not clear that the answer to a question like this is even metric independent. Okay, here it says it just depends on x, and when x is simply connected. Okay, so it turns out that, so that's really an anomaly about one-dimensional geometry of the domain. But when you have, say, two-dimensional geometry or something like that, as far as we know, you're really forced to work multiplicatively. And we showed that for a large class of spaces that include G mod H, homogeneous spaces, it's a condition defined in terms of rational homotopy, whatever that means. But rational homotopy means if I turn on my rational glasses, these homotopy groups are zero, so my space looks like it's a point, for which this is a trivial result. Okay? So in general, these kind of problems end up having a strong rational homotopy theoretic component. Okay? And for the most common spaces that you kick your foot against, you tend to have this with a multiplicative constant. We were very proud of that, and we also gave the first example of a simply connected space. The target was S4. I think this was something like S2 cross CP4. I mean, some particular domain for which you need to go more than linear in order to find the homotopy. So I'm going to maybe stop there because I feel like I want to talk another hour or two. So it's better that I cut it right here.